Hello, I'm Lisa Rotondo McCord, Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs at the New Orleans Museum of Art. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the program, Reflections on Women in Ancient and Modern Egypt, presented by Dr. Monica Hanna, Associate Professor and Acting Dean at the Arab Academy for Science, Technology, and Maritime Transport. Dr. Hanna's presentation is part of NOMA's programming for Queen Nefertari's Egypt, which is on view at the museum until July 17th. We're grateful not only to Dr. Hanna for her enlightening presentation, but also to Dr. Haitham Eid, Director of the Museum Studies Program at the Southern University of New Orleans, who coordinated this talk and serves as its facilitator.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Haitham Eid. I'm Professor and Director of the Master of Arts in Museum Studies Program at Southern University of New Orleans. I'm very excited today to host Dr. Monica Hanna to speak about ancient Egypt and how white men, archaeologists and Egyptologists impacted the narrative about women in ancient Egypt. I'm gonna introduce Dr. Hanna, and then she will give her talk, and then we're gonna have some discussion after that. So Dr. Monica Hanna is an international figure in the world of archaeology. She did her undergraduate studies in Egyptology and archaeological chemistry at the American University in Cairo in 2004. Hanna then pursued a master's degree in teaching English as foreign language in 2006 at AUC as well. She later joined the University of Pisa, Italy, to complete her doctorate in archaeology entitled Problems of Preservation of Mural Paintings in the Theban Necropolis, a pilot study on the Theban Tomb 14 using 3D scanning techniques. From July 2011 until November 2012, Monica was a postdoctoral fellow in the Tupi Cluster of Excellence in the Department of Egyptology and North African Studies in Hamburg University. Currently, Hanna is Associate Professor and Acting Dean of the College of Archaeology and Cultural Heritage at the Arab Academy for Science and Technology and Maritime Transport in Aswan, Egypt, where she has founded a program specialized in archaeology and cultural heritage with 8 departments for the BA level. Her research focuses on space, knowledge, and identity of archaeological sites, with particular interest on different meanings and reflections of heritage on identity of space and communities. She has worked on a project in Al-Qarna, Luxor, on the different narratives of the multiple words of the Theban necropolis and its meaning to the various stakeholders. Post the year 2011, which we know that's the time of the Egyptian uprising, Hanna has been working with the media and a group of volunteers to bring awareness to the plight of various archaeological sites in Egypt, including and especially Dahshur, Abu Sir al-Malik, and ancient Heliopolis. She courageously spoke and defended the heritage of Egypt and its protection. Wow. Hanna has been granted numerous awards, including the Save Bacon Award for 2014 for her efforts in the salvage of antiquities under conflict, and was named by UNESCO the Monuments Woman of 2014. She has also received distinguished AUC alumna 2 times, once in Cairo 2014 and the other in New York 2015. Her current research focuses on decolonizing archaeology, repatriation, and restitution amongst methods of accessibility for the wider public to archaeology and heritage, with particular interest in digital humanities. In 2020, she was chosen as one of the 50 most influential women in Egypt under the auspices of the Egyptian Prime Minister. In 2020 also, she was awarded a research grant as part of Action for Restitution in Africa in collaboration with the University of Oxford, where she's working on starting a solid discourse of decolonizing Western museum collections. Wow. Monica, it's just impressive CV, and I know you have more, but we don't have the time to read all of this. But it's amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Haitham, for this lovely introduction. I'm looking forward to discuss with you the ideas of the talk today. And thank you again for hosting me for this. Thanks. Hello, welcome and good morning. I'm Monica Hanna, talking to you today from Aswan. I would like to discuss a few ideas in this talk pertaining to colonialism, post-colonialism, and androcentrism applied to the field of Egyptology. Since at many points I've also experienced this firsthand, I thought maybe this could give a different idea about women in ancient Egypt. I'd like to start by a brief historical introduction. Here, this is a photo of Cairo Revolution. And Cairo Revolution, here I'm not speaking about 2011 or 2013. I'm here relating to the revolution against Napoleon. When Napoleon came to Egypt in 1799, 1798, he brought a huge army. Napoleon had wanted to be a modern replica of Alexander the Great. He wanted to mimic his great military adventures. And so he thought that Egypt is the gate to such military breakthrough. And that's why he was very interested in conquering Egypt. Not only Napoleon wanted to conquer Egypt military, but he also brought with him the different savants. And these savants wanted to document and discover Egypt that was in the Bible, that was in the Old Testament, that travelers wrote about and thought about and so on. So we have in this painting that's oil on paper, a sketch for the revolt in Cairo. People think that many times Egyptians were very happy with the Feringa or the French coming to conquer them because they brought enlightenment. But the truth is that Egyptians fought very hardly the French when they came to Egypt. And it's not as romantic as the French would like to present it to the world on how they brought enlightenment and the discovery of ancient Egypt to Egypt. So here we see this photo that looks very chaotic. It has touches of nudity. And it shows about how the French troops viciously suppressed the uprising in Cairo and the great massacre at the mosque of Al-Azhar. In the next image, we see here the Mamluks versus the French army. And of course, the backdrop will always be the pyramids, as we'll also see in the next painting. And of course, the Mamluks under the Ottoman sovereignty did not have a real army in the modern sense. They tried to fight the French with chivalry and their elaborate kaftans. Of course, the Mamluks were not of Egyptian origins. They came from East Europe and lived in Egypt under Ottoman rule. However, they thought that they were protecting their own land, and they were supported by many of the locals or many of the Ahel. In this painting by Antoine Jancroux that was done in 1810, commissioned by Napoleon himself to cover up for the severe military defeat that he had seen in Egypt, not just the resistance by the Egyptians, but also the British loss. Of course, Napoleon angered the Ottomans and the British wanted to stop Napoleon, so they teamed up with the Ottomans and of course won the famous Battle of Abu Qir against Napoleon. Napoleon here in this image that he chose the colors, chose the topic, chose everything, wanted to portray his idea about the anthropological other, which is us, the Egyptians. And you can see here how he wanted to show how fashionable. He was in his nice uniform on a white horse, very chivalrous. And then, of course, the backdrop is the pyramid, because everything revolved around discovering ancient Egypt. And that was the cover-up story for such a bitter military defeat that he had. And you can see how here we have General Kleber, and that is then later defeated. And you can see here how he wanted to have the French looking very smart, looking very elegant, while he portrayed here the Egyptians almost naked. And not just naked, we have here the Egyptians carrying the little weapons, hiding with women. So this is very obvious about how the West stereotyped women of Egypt, or the anthropological other, in a way, and we'll discuss this further. And of course, nudity in art has been always a sign sometimes of a lesser person, of course, compared here with the elaborate French uniforms, although back then the Mamluks and the Egyptians wore very elaborate kaftans that were very colorful. But of course, it's the choice of Napoleon to paint us in such an inferior manner. And you can see here General Kleber and the Egyptian hiding with the women, and it's in a way a projection of the anthropological other. We know later that General Kleber is killed by Levantine student Suleiman al-Halabi in Cairo, and then he's buried back in France. Then we have this fascinating painting that I really like very much. It shows the group of the French savants on Pompey's pillar in Alexandria, and surprisingly, also the pyramids in the backdrop, although the pyramids would never be seen from Alexandria. But then again, it's telling their audience that this is happening in Egypt in case they do not identify Pompey's pillar. And you see, this is us, the Egyptians, being represented as these barbarians, attacking, of course, the French savants who are bringing enlightenment and showing us as Bedouins and as people who do not appreciate such Western enlightenment coming to us by Napoleon. And you can even see how they portrayed the savants to be very scared of us Egyptians, that they even have at some point wings, because of course they're very angelic and they're full of positive and enlightenment, and we represent the other side of the darkness. And unfortunately, to this day, a good percentage of Westerners and also some post-colonialists in Egypt insist that without the French imperialist colonial campaign on Egypt, no one would have discovered ancient Egypt, as the current Egyptians have no credit for knowing their history, and all the credit goes to the West. And of course, this can be seen in many of the discourses, and here showing the French savants discovering the Sphinx. And of course, one of the articles written in the 21st century says how Napoleon's invasion revealed Egypt to the world and to itself. So we Egyptians should be super thankful of the French campaign, because without it, we would have never known our past. And of course, as Italians thinking about the French, they know, of course, the French tricks, and they know that Napoleon used this idea of the description de l'Egypte. Of course, it's a great resource, but that how Napoleon spinned this politically to hide his bitter military defeat by the combined army that was composed by the British and the Ottomans. So here they draw him in a sarcophagus that he can't move, and of course pyramids in the backdrop, and they're trying to make fun of him, that this is how he hides in a way. This does not stop at this point, because the French discover the Rosetta Stone, or Hajar Rashid, and they discover it in Mamluk fort in the city of Rashid at the apex of the Nile with the Mediterranean. And among other 17 objects, they become sequestrated by the British Army. The Champollion, who deciphered the Rosetta Stone, has worked on facsimiles most of his life. But then that's why the Rosetta Stone went to the British Museum. So basically, it was just a spoil of war. As I always tell my students, that a thief stole a robbery, then a bandit cut the road and stole the robbery from the thief. That's exactly what happened with the Rosetta Stone. So any really talk about Rosetta being legal in the British Museum is fantasy. And then we have this famous statue of Champollion standing on the head of Ramses II. And it shows how this idea of cultural victory of the anthropological other was very important for the French to hide their military defeat. So they had to pretend that, oh no, we won against the other, we won against the brutal Pharaoh that we read about in the Bible who did this and this to Moses and so on. So this has been also a cultural victory. It's not, the military defeat is now forgotten, that they actually lost the war. But everyone now thinks that it was France who discovered ancient Egypt and let us know about the wonderful texts and scripts. Of course, the imperialism and colonialism also went hand in hand with androcentrism. So what I would like to call it as patriarchal colonialism, since this is how it interpreted the past. It interpreted our Egyptian past from the perspective of the Western white man. And stereotypes of women, of the cultural other women, as we've seen in the painting commissioned by Napoleon, dominated the way Western Egyptologists have always interpreted the role of women in ancient Egypt and in modern Egypt. This was also used to create a Western identity, because at this point in the 19th century, Europe was creating its new identity that's trying to move from monarchy, trying to create this European identity. And this identity was created also by showing how different they are from the cultural other. So this difference from the modern Egyptian, by showing this helped Europe also create its modern identity. This imperialism, colonialism, and androcentrism also created a very big culture separation between today's Egyptians and their history. And of course, gender claims are at the heart of the cultural separation between between modern and ancient Egypt. And the white man, or the white male man, had a very strong role in creating the otherness of ancient Egypt versus modern Egypt. I would like also to rethink such ideas of androcentrism and how it relates to colonialism and imperialism through the light of 20th century philosophies, such as the embodiment by Merleau-Ponty, the role of the museum as an institution of power by Michel Foucault, and of course, the gender theory of Judith Butler. And we cannot forget, of course, the monumental work of Edward Said on Orientalism and how this created a stereotype of the cultural other. The beginning of the cultural plunder of ancient Egypt by the West was not only just the artifacts, but it was also a way for the European man to subjugate the Egyptian woman under the authority of the male European man. And we see that in the writings of the Gustave Flaubert, the French traveler who went to Kushokhenem in Esna. And of course, he used her sexually. And the way he describes the experience in a sort of a triumph for Western male power over the Egyptian woman. And we only know of Flaubert's account. We have never received a written account or even an oral tradition from Khosrow-Khanem. And this remains in a way connected, the 19th century stereotype of the woman of the Orient, who is erotic, who is sexualized. It also related her to ancient Egypt, because we can look here at the connection in the 20th century. Here we have a great Egyptologist, Professor Jan Aswan, who I studied all his publications as a student. In his book on preservation and presentation of the self in ancient Egyptian portraiture, published in 1996, he describes Nefertiti as follows. She is a love poem in stone. And he explicitly then writes, her very refined sensuousness and almost erotic grace and radiance comes along. So we have this highly sexualization of Egyptian women in ancient Egypt, although we rarely see Egyptologists writing about how she was a powerful woman, how she came from a family tradition with Queen T, and who was her mother-in-law, was a very powerful woman as well, because Amenhotep III at certain points was interested in other things, and she took things in control. And even Nefertiti, we see her iconography wearing the Nubian wig, which is the wig people would wear for war, but women would not possibly wear a Nubian wig. And we rarely see this in the writings of Egyptologists about Egyptian women. So this Orientalist interest in Egyptian women falls in this sexualization, in the idea of the harem and relating it also to ancient Egypt, and this mix between the 19th century stereotypes of women and ancient Egypt. And then in May 1929, there is a visit by King Fuad to Berlin, because he wanted to visit Herr Hitler at that time. And there was then the negotiations between Egypt and Germany to repatriate the bust of Nefertiti, which Ludwig Borchardt illegally took out of Egypt because he was a member of the Egyptology Committee in Egypt, and he knew very well that it was not allowed absolutely to take any masterpieces outside of Egypt. So King Fuad goes to Berlin and he visits the bust of Nefertiti. He goes to see her with Hitler, but he does not discuss her repatriation. It was a political visit. And this is here a cartoon that spoke about the visit in Clarida Dutch, which is a cartoon magazine in Germany, Berlin, based in Berlin. And it says, it makes fun of King Fuad. It's a fat Fuad. Do you want to take Nefertiti with you? And they don't even call him fat Fuadchen, which means in German, fat little Fuad, which is very, very disrespectful. And then they tell him, do you want to take Nefertiti back home so she becomes your favorite wife in the harem? So again, sexualizing Nefertiti, thinking that King Fuad would only want to take her because he wants to take her to the harem. And this very continuous undertone that Egyptian women would always be sexualized in the eyes of the white Western man. By 1930, after the Lacan and Schaeffer agree to repatriate the bust, and in exchange, Egypt would give Germany 2 other statues, the Prussian government agrees on giving back the bust, but then Herr Hitler refuses. And the Reich government vetoes the decision of the Prussian government, and Nefertiti stays a prisoner in Paris. We know later that Hitler himself had a fetish for the bust of Nefertiti, and he went even further at saying that she must have had Aryan origins. And he said, what stays to the Germans, what belongs to the Germans stays for the Germans, or what the Germans people have, they keep, depends on the translation from the German. And he dreamt of creating this new Museum of Europa, where Nefertiti would be the centerpiece under the dome. And of course, later after the war, we find Nefertiti in the same bunker with many of the Jewish looted material culture. We also see different representations of Nefertiti, always surrounded by men. And as if she has this sexual attraction to her persona that has been created. And there was always this idea of these ideas evolving around the ancient East and the modern West. And in a way, there was a continuous separation between this ancient East and the modern West, because the West wanted the ancient East to continue being separated so they can easily culturally appropriate it. So the patriarchy coupled with imperial domination, of course, failed at looking at a powerful woman like Nefertiti, because she's powerful, she's strong, and the more, of course, excavations went on and we found history about her, we realized that she's challenging the stereotype of the modern, the Western modernity in a way that was being formed. Here, we see, of course, Nefertiti becomes a symbol of Berlin, and one of the ads in Berlin about the Berliner Morgenpost is that Berlin is where the most beautiful immigrant lives. But is she really immigrant? Of course, I see that Nefertiti in this museum is in a way a violence to Egyptians, women's rights, and the bust is separate from the rest of the Amarna group. She's being put away. She becomes a symbol for beauty salons, for plastic surgery advertisement. Again, looking at the beautification of women rather than her role in the society, her role as a strong woman. And of course, she appeared at many fashion magazines, and this assimilation of beauty only and of women representation was very strong in many of the ideas where Berlin used Nefertiti. So this other woman was different from Berliners and different from the Germans, was being appropriated in a way. And they even went very further to say that she's only appreciated in the West, and that if she comes back to Cairo, people will no longer appreciate her, as if it's only the white man who can appreciate such beauty and so on. Western stereotypes of Egyptian women was mostly spread through Western academia and sometimes Egyptians until very recently. Of course, despite the fact that archaeology and anthropology started evolving with the social theory development since 1950s until today, Egyptology lagged behind for lack of a solid theoretical framework, a solid theoretical background. Egyptology was invented by Western scholars studying Egypt. And they wanted to keep it as this sort of a gentleman white male club. And even Egyptians such as Ahmad Kamal Besha, when they struggled to enter this white gentleman club, it was very difficult for him. I find many of his letters written at the archive saying how he's not allowed to read texts at the museum by Mariette, and they would not put him in positions. And this white gentleman club of Egyptology did not just hurt Egyptians in general, but it also hurt how they've interpreted the role of women in the past. And in a way, the West has created a disembodied vision of ancient Egypt, where it's unisensory. It's not a multisensory female perception of the past, about how the past can also be seen differently when it's decolonized. Of course, this happens because many of the activities would be seen through the men, the wars, the construction. But then here, an image of Hatshepsut, it's very difficult. She's the woman who would send men to sail the sea, to go to Punt, and who would be very successful economically. And such figures provided male androcentrism with very difficult questions. Of course, women in ancient Egypt were being studied also by men when they were powerful, because in a way, power is male in their idea. So you'd see studies about Cleopatra, studies about Hatshepsut, about Ahotep, about Mernis, but because women outside of power would also be limited to their gender roles of childbearing and cooking and housekeeping, without any critical attention. And this can even be seen in Deir el-Madina, when Schiaparelli, the Italian archaeologists, discovered. He interpreted much of the architecture from his male point of view, that he missed the birthing houses, that he missed why women would actually have these chairs in their living room, and many others in different excavations. Here, this is a beautiful painting by Mahmoud Said. And Mahmoud Said started drawing Egyptian women in the 20th century, showing women in regular roles, not necessarily powerful women. And more studies, of course, in the 20th century started looking at how since, of course, Judith Butler work, more women such as Lynn Meskel, Mariam Ayed started looking at women. And that's why even Mariam Ayed wrote a great book about the gods' wives of Amun. They're just priestesses in the temple for Amun. So they're not queens, they're not rulers, they're priestesses. So we get more studies just recently about the role of women that is non-traditional, and that's outside, a little bit outside of the power circle. With British imperialism in Egypt, the image of modern women in Egypt also remained quite unrealistic. The early British women writers did not wish to deal with modern Egyptian women, but only wrote about ancient Egyptian deities and how they were transferred to Greek deities later. They also saw the effect of Islamic and Arab culture as a threat to the image of ancient Egypt, rather than embracing the palimpsest of the culture that interacted with each other. They only saw this as a threat. The West wanted to take ancient Egypt, to break away completely, to keep it under control, because they didn't know how to manage with the other layers of Egypt. And of course, it gets more complex. We get, of course, the book Black Athena, although I have very serious issues with the book, but then this idea of the Western appropriation, that ancient Egypt is white. And then you get the Afrocentric movement in the 1970s, which I believe is just a pure mirror to Eurocentrism. You can tell how Eurocentric ideas about ancient Egypt shows Egyptians as white and looking European, and even you get very inaccurate studies saying, Tutankhamun was the grandfather genetically of, 70 male British people. Or you get these fictitious studies. And also in most films, in most drawings, ancient Egypt in Europe would be white, while here you can see that ancient Egypt was being appropriated and looking black. So Egyptians also find, in a way, this is very difficult. They're unable to see Egypt as being Egyptian. That's neither white nor black. And here you can see Queen Latifah appropriating the crown of Nefertiti, and here a European woman looking at Nefertiti. And this is particularly taking a very strong place in the arguments these days, especially on social media, between Afrocentric tendencies and Eurocentric tendencies, the nationalism movements. And this is all creating a problem that started 200 years ago. Here you can also see that Egyptians always thought of Nefertiti as their patron woman, because even her image, the bust of her image, was being used in Egyptian films. This is the film by Omar Sharif and directed by Fatin Abdel Wahab, where Omar Sharif was in need for to have fictitious love letters written. And so he chooses an image of, first image was Queen of England, and then second one is Nefertiti. And he responds to him, I mean, it's impossible that you have a relationship with this woman. Then we have, of course, the Egyptian feminist movement that's largely ignored by the West. The West, in a way, wants to see feminism evolve in the Western sense, and they ignore any local movements for feminism. And here we have Nabawiya Musa, who wrote the first book inspired by ancient Egypt called Nub Hotep. It's a beautiful play, and unfortunately, it was never published to any European language. Nefertiti did not only inspire films in the 1960s. Nefertiti was very present in the 2011 revolution when women were sexually harassed in Tahrir Square. They looked at Nefertiti for strength. And Nefertiti was no longer this beautiful, sensuous woman as Jan Aswan would write about her. Nefertiti was then a warrior, as she originally was. And they edited her image wearing this gas mask. So instead of her wearing a Nubian wig, as she would in ancient Egypt, she wore a gas mask. And she was available in she was present, in the Tahrir Square demonstrations against sexual harassment and in the feminist movements. With this image, I'd like to thank you very much for the talk today, and thank you for giving me the chance to discuss some of my ideas. Have a pleasant day.
Monica, wow, this is amazing. This is fascinating. Your work is inspiring. It makes us rethink, reinterpret Egyptian history and our relationship to artifacts and how we understand the interpretation of Egyptian archaeology. So thank you so much for this. What does inspire you to do this work?
I think it has to do with me coming from Middle Egypt and coming from a strong matriarchal family in a way. First time I've seen Nefertiti was in 2007. And I remember when I first arrived to Berlin and saw her in this glass box and in a room full of male guards. And the director of
Monica, we lost your voice. We lost your voice. Hello?
Hello?
Yes, you're back. Okay.
I think it has to do with me first seeing Nefertiti in Berlin in a room full of guards, and the director was also male, and I was not impressed by the way he spoke about her. And that led me to start reading and analyzing why would this happen. And since then, I've been interested in such discourses of women and power and androcentrism and imperialism and how they all interact together.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's amazing too that the new generation of Egyptologists, archaeologists, and cultural heritage specialists see women who are leading the way. Personally, when I was in Cairo University, I was taught by Fatma Helmi, one of the amazing women who led the Department of Restoration for a long time. And I know you talk in your scholarship or other women who inspired you, like Faiza Haykal, Tuhfa Handous, and others. So
Yes.
can you talk about those who inspired you,
I've mostly studied with women. My academic advisor was Salima Ikram. My mentor was Faiza Haykal. Then it was Marilina Betro in Pisa, and then Claudia Neisser in Berlin. So I've mostly worked with women. And I think that gave me a different perspective about the past and about how we see the past. I've also been interested in the feminist Egyptian movements in Egypt. And I was interested in the works of Durraya Shafi. I was interested in the work of Nabawiya Musa, who was the first woman to write a play about ancient Egypt in 1912. So I think such interests that I've cultivated at the end matured into this research.
Yeah, yeah. And let me dig a little deeper. And one of the comments you made about Sulaiman al-Halabi. To those who do not know, Sulaiman al-Halabi was a Levantine student studying in Egypt in Al-Azhar University. And when he saw the French massacres in Egypt, he was inspired to assassinate General Kleber, who was responsible for many of the killings of local Egyptians. And the way he was killed, I'm talking about Sulaiman al-Halabi, after, they captured him and they burned his hands and they assassinated him by anal implement. And then they took his skull, and now is displayed in a museum in Paris. Musée de la Homme, I believe, is the name of the museum in Paris. So, yes. And also you talk about the story of Rosetta Stone, was found by the invader, the French invaders, and then was a spoil of war by the British. They captured it from the French, and now it's in the British Museum. How these two stories present a problem for Western museums?
I think it's very obvious that we're in the 21st century. We're no longer in the 19th century. I think we all operate with a different ethical code. And such crimes of the past cannot just go unnoticed and cannot go without real critique and correction, because it's okay that we also critique, but we also need to correct mistakes that happened in the past. I think that we need to challenge this idea that without the French, we would not have Egyptology. And I think it's really a masquerade for their military defeat. And you can see, you can read also from El-Gabarti all what the horror stories the French did in Egypt. So if we look at the bronzes of Benin and how the British wiped out a whole village to take such bronzes, this is not so different from what the French did in Egypt. It's just that they have whitewashed their crimes under the idea of cultural discoveries and cultural enlightenment. And I think we need to confront them seriously, because if this is not properly confronted, they will continue to plunder our heritage, just as exactly how the director of the Louvre was arrested, was indicted 2 years ago for buying looted heritage still in the 21st century. So in a way, such cultural imperialism is all connected. And without confronting the crimes of the past, we will continue losing our heritage, and we will continue also losing our agency to produce knowledge about our past.
Thank you. Thank you for this answer, Monica. Does anybody have question for Monica? Just welcome any questions if any are there. If not, I can keep asking questions. You mentioned, Monica, something about Afrocentrism and Eurocentrism, and how Egypt got in the middle of both ideologies. How do you see that? Because this is a big issue here in the US when we talk about Egypt, and how Egypt is structured, and curriculum here is studied under Europe. You know, it's started with ancient Egypt, Greek, and then European civilization. So it's detached from its origin and its the content of Africa. And then you have the other movement that says, no, Egypt is part of Africa, and it's we need to be proud of this history as African history. So where does Egypt stand?
I think Egypt has yet to write its Egyptocentric view, because Egypt has been written by everyone except by Egyptians. So I think we have to yet write our Egyptocentric view of our past, which we have not. I believe that also part of the colonialism has given this idea that the only real culture is in Egypt and Africa, and that's not true, because Africa has many spectacular cultures that are not Egyptians. The Ethiopian, the Benin Kingdom. And the problem with the West is that they've wanted to continuously in the 19th and the 20th century to portray that Africa does not have a culture. And the only place that has culture is Egypt. So it was normal that everyone from Africa wanting to identify according to the Western perspective of culture, that they would identify with ancient Egypt. So I think we need to relook at the different cultures in Africa, venerate them differently, and also restitute and repatriate their cultural heritage. I think part of the problem is that only 30% of African heritage remained in Africa and 70% has been looted. So we need to rethink such collections and rethink. And of course, Egypt is in Africa, but Egypt lies in this very unique position that it's part of the Mediterranean cultures, it's part of the ancient Near Eastern cultures, and it's part of the African cultures. So I think Egypt is this melting pot. It is part of everything and is not just one specific type.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And also the geographic location of Egypt makes it, you know, very unique position to be, as you mentioned, melting pot. My kids watch songs about maps, and Egypt is counted in Asia because part of Egypt is in Asia. It's the only Afro-Asian country. So it's counted as part of Asia and part of in Africa. So they got confused. Where is Egypt? Is it Asia or Africa? And I told them it's both. It's you know, located in both continents. So so that gives an idea about what Egypt is and what can give to the world. Monica, let me ask you, how is your work being received among your colleagues and, you know, your friends, the community, when you talk about sexualization and imperialism, and it's, you know, is it because it's very inspiring, but it can also be challenging to some people that, you know, that they are not used to hear this narrative. So can you tell us how is your work being received?
It depends on where it is being received. In museums, they're very afraid of my work because they know that the end result is that we want the objects back. We want the heritage repatriated as well as the agency. So it depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to professionals at museums, such as the Noise Museum or the British Museum, they're very worried and they don't want to hear this, and they say no, Egyptians don't want their heritage back. That's even the curator of the Rosetta Stone said that. You have no idea what the Egyptians want. That's what she told me, and she's British. She's actually German, working in London, and I'm the Egyptian person in the conversation. And then you get people working at universities, and the universities have moved forward. They know that the ethical values in the 21st century no longer hold object, and on the contrary, people now are speaking about breaking the power of the museum, and how the museum as an institution of power needs to change and needs to evolve and needs to move on to the 21st century. So it depends really who you're talking to. Yeah, I get invited by the Goethe Institute in Berlin to speak twice about Nefertiti, and I give my talk, but then a few kilometers from the Goethe Institute, the Noise Museum. They're very scared of us speaking that we want Nefertiti back. So it depends really on which side
Right.
you are. And I think this I've spoken about the sexualization of women in Arabic in the gender studies department of Kuwait University. So I think women in the Middle East are moving forward. They're interested in such topics and interested to see how this affects how we write our past, about how women have been written out of the historical record and written in a skewed manner that has to do with the white man.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is important, and you talk about, is reinstituting the artifacts to to where they came from. But one of the things also that I'm thinking about is how museum collections are being interpreted. Do you feel it's important for museums to employ people with diverse backgrounds, so the narrative that being created are also diverse and also considering the cultural diversity in the community and in the collection?
Yes, definitely. And I think also objects need to have a story of how they've arrived to these museums. And writing this history of how these objects ended up here I think, is of equal importance. And that would not happen unless you have a diverse team writing the past. And I think ancient Egypt belongs to everyone. It does not only belong to Egyptians. And I think all narratives should be included, even narratives. I always tell my students, we have written the social history of our archaeological sites out of our official records. We have never written about fertility rituals with temples or with tombs. We have not written about where children played in temples and what type of games they played, and what oral history with the archaeological sites used to have. We don't have that documented. So we have written at many times modern communities also outside of the narrative. And I think museums need to also include that. I always look at the image of Nefertiti with the gas mask and think about how the past is very relevant in the present, and how these women in Tahrir Square looked for her strength as a woman. And I think objects need to have this value in societies. They're not locked in these dead spaces of the museums. I think objects need to be with the people, and they need to build new historical layers.
Yeah. Monica, again, thank you so much. That was very exciting, very enlightening. When I look at Nefertiti's statue now, I see different things that I never thought of before. So thank you so much for this research, this work. I think it's amazing. So please keep doing what you're doing. Any other questions before we close this session? Any comments? Yes, Dr. House.
Benin is one of my areas of research, and I was able to spend some time there in the 1960s. And at that time, the people, of course, were very, very adamant in wanting their art back. And they have been actively for decades trying to convince museums around the world and governments around the world to send the work back. And of course, museums have had all kinds of excuses. They've said things like, oh, if we send the art back, it won't be well taken care of. If we send the art back, it might be sold on the art market, all kinds of things. So I'm happy to say that Ajayi, who built the African American Museum at the Smithsonian, is now building a museum in Benin City to house the work that's returned. But of course, now in Benin City, there's an argument going on because the current Oba of Benin wants the work returned to the palace where it was stolen from. And then, of course, internationally, people say if we send the art back, we'd like it to be in the new museum where it'll be well cared for in a museum environment. And we know it'll be taken care of. And I'm sure that the National Museum also has something to say about this. So I'm wondering, is there a really active movement on the world, museum world, to get objects like Nefertiti and many, many other things back? I've been to the Louvre and I've seen all that art. I've been to the museums in New York and seen so much of your art there. And I wondered, what is the relationship between Egypt now and the museums of the world and the governments to get your art back? That was my question.
Thank you very much, Professor Hollis. And I'm interested in not just getting governments to talk to each other. I'm interested in creating bridges of discourse between the people and the people. Because I think the museum at the end is an institution that's looking for its own interests as well as the governments. But I want to deconstruct this argument that it's not a government speaking with a museum. I want it to be the people themselves taking the initiative to restitute the agency of what has been taken from them. So I'm more interested in not just the restitution of the objects, but to the restitution of the agency, where the people would have a choice by having accessibility to the knowledge. There's a problem also that we have in Egypt is that we have not published for the Egyptian public. Most of books written about ancient Egypt are written in English, French, and German, and very, 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 very few are written in Arabic. So this we cannot ask people to appreciate something they don't know about. So I'm interested in giving accessibility and the agency to the Egyptians to know about what has been taken from them, what do they need to do, and then they walk the road. Because I think in the 1930s, the negotiations to repatriate Nefertiti failed because it was between the king and Hitler. And I think then in 46, it failed because it was between also the king and the army in 1946. And I think it has to be the people making the noise for asking for restituting their objects back. And I look at the work the Greeks are doing for restituting the Parthenon marble, Italians are doing to restitute their statues from the Getty Institute, and it's more of a people's movement. So I'm interested in getting the people to know what has been taken from them, and that's why most of my talks I also insist on giving them in Arabic, and I go to villages and speak to people of how these objects were taken from these communities, rather than getting the government to move or to officially request. I think this would come at a later stage, but for this later stage to be successful, I'm working on creating a real public momentum at wanting our culture back, not for nationalist futile feelings or not because we Egyptians are superior. No, not like this. Because I want Egyptians to understand that this is their cultural right. This is how they engage with their past. And that's how they can move to the future, by creating such relations.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Monica. That's amazing. Many thanks to New Orleans Museum of Art and our colleagues there for making this happen. So we appreciate it and look forward to more talks in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Haitham. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you.